Boxy, we're live. Hi, this is Larry Harnish, and this is Boxy with the Ask Me Anything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel for August 2025. And I just was informed that Instagram is going to cut off live videos for people who don't have 1,000 subscribers. And I don't have 1,000 subscribers. I doubt that I ever will. Okay. But this is the Ask Me Anything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel for August 2025. It's only George Hodel and Steve Hodel questions. I have another session on the Black Dahlia. That will be August 5th. Okay, so this is July. Did I say August? Okay, this is July. August 5th for the next Dahlia session, and I think it's August 19th for the next George Hodel. So this is going to be only Steve Hodel and George Hodel, and it is Ask Me Anything. It is not Tell Me Anything. Questions are welcome. Trolls are not welcome. So anyway, who am I and how did I get started with this? I'm Larry Harnish. I have been researching the Black Dahlia case since 1996. And I've been fact-checking Steve Hodel since publication of Black Dahlia Avenger in 2003. So that's how I got into it. For a long time, I thought it was my obligation to set the record straight on the Black Dahlia case. So I would talk to anybody with a microphone and a camera. I don't do that anymore. I don't give interviews anymore. I do not give interviews anymore. I did one to the LA Times and that was it. For the simple reason that I got really fed up with the true crime genre. I'm going to talk about that. It's just increasingly shoddy and sensational, and I just don't want to be part of that. So I don't do that anymore. I do these instead. I enjoy them a lot more. So that's kind of how I got started doing that. Again, any trolls, you're going to get the block hammer will come out immediately. Okay, so that's that's kind of who I am. 34 years in journalism, 27 at the Los Angeles Times. I will talk for a little bit, and then I will open it up for questions. And a couple of things. First of all, old business. I said last time I talked about the hemicorporectomy, and I said I was going to cut in an illustration of where the spine is severed in a hemicorporectomy versus where a spine is severed where Elizabeth Short was severed. I can't do that. I do not have the technical ability to do that. So here it is. Very briefly, this is an illustration of the human spine. This is the second and third lumbar vertebrae. Okay, that's where Elizabeth Short was cut, was here. Okay, when you do the hemicorporectomy, the spine is cut down here. Okay, it's in a different location. It's a different procedure. It is not the same. People could survive having their spine cut here. No one could survive it being cut up here, plus having her intestines cut where Elizabeth Short's intestines were cut. The people who had the hemicorporectomy kept their vital organs. So it is a different procedure. Anyway, that's under old business. Okay. First of all, there is another Dahlia book coming out. I think last time I talked about Eli Frankel's Sisters in Crime, which is out now. It was written up in People magazine and places like that. It's the Carl Balsiger book. He doesn't talk about George Hodel at all. George Hodel is like a non-entity. This time I'm going to talk very briefly about another forthcoming book. This one is by William J. Mann. He's done some Hollywood biographies. So he's kind of a known writer. And I should disclose that William Mann asked to interview me. And as I said, I don't do interviews, and I couldn't see any benefit to giving him an interview. So I said, no, I don't do that. And that was, I forget when he asked. It might have been last year. I forget but he did email me, and I said no. Well, I have an advanced copy of his book, which is again coming out in January, and he dispenses with George Hodel pretty quickly. there is and I should back up and say, Mann says at the outset of his book, I'm not going to try to solve this case. It is hubris at this point, after all these years, to try to solve the Black Dahlia case. So I'm not going to try to solve it. And it's more of a catalog of different suspects and theories and that kind of thing, and kind of the life of Elizabeth Short. I'm not too far into it. I will be talking more about it in the Black Dahlia session when I've actually finished reading it. I'm just partway into it. And I will just say Mann seems to have good intentions in writing it. He's not trying to pin it on a particular individual. He kind of picks apart all the books that try to solve the Black Dahlia case. He kind of picks them all apart. He's got some good information. He's got some good resources. But holy smokes, does he make some mistakes. I mean, I was reading, and I won't say what it is right now, but I was reading one section of the book, and my jaw was on the floor. It's like, oh my God, don't tell me he didn't do that. Yeah, he did that. And I'm not going to say at this point what it is, because it doesn't involve George Hodel. But it's like, wow. People want to know why my book has taken so long. It's so I don't make, horrendous mistakes like that. Anyway, he talks about George Hodel. He devotes about 2 pages to George Hodel. He summarizes he kind of does a thumbnail biography of George Hodel. He summarizes the trial, the Tamar Hodel trial. And he says Tamar was painted as a liar, which is true. She was. She happened to be a liar, but that's another. The trial of George Hodel is a big subject, and I'm not going to get into it now. But anyway, he summarizes that, and then he goes into George Hodel was put under surveillance for 5.5 weeks. That's true. He says the conversations were kind of muffled and inconclusive, and after 5.5 weeks, they pulled the plug on the bug and went away. And that's all true, regardless of what Steve says. Yeah, it's in boxy. They just 5.5 weeks. There is no there, and they pulled up and left, and that was that. And that's about it. Now, he has in his endnotes, he's got some more material on Steve Hodel. He discusses Steve's alleged photographs of Elizabeth Short that Elizabeth Short's family says they're not her. He talks about that. I think he talks about some other things. I don't recall, but they're in the endnotes rather than in the actual text of the book. But he says one thing that is just staggering, and it's like, wow, boy, is that not true? He says that Antoth and George Hodel connected later on, and it's like, boy, howdy, I have never seen that anywhere. And his source is Antoth's family. Okay, I've interviewed Antoth's family. I've talked to them. I've read. There's 2 statements in here from Antoth, and I have read Mark Sjostrom's summary of his interviews with Antoth. If you don't know, Mark Sjostrom is a longtime Black Dahlia researcher. He tracked down Antoth. He did a couple of he cold called her. He called her up and talked to her about Elizabeth Short and all that kind of thing. Did a pretty long phone interview. And then I think he called back and did maybe a second one. And then he called back later and found out she had died. So it was really at the end of her life. And to summarize very briefly, what Antoth told Mark Sjostrom is almost, in some places, it's word for word what's in Boxy, which is kind of impressive. But anyway, but I have talked to Antoth's family, and I will tell you right now, they are very wary. They are very guarded. They're very guarded about their privacy, especially when it comes to the Black Dahlia and Antoth. They were not forthcoming with a lot of information, and I don't know if he's got somewhere in the book in his acknowledgments which relative of Antoth he's talked to. But having talked to one of her, a close relative, it's like, yeah, I'm really suspicious of that. And then the other thing he talks about is he says, well, Ann Toth said that she didn't recognize George Hodel, but she was so busy with all these other men who were coming to the house, like Maurice Clement and Otero, the little Spanish teacher, and all these other guys. And the reality is, no, that didn't happen. How do I know? Because it's in here. It's in Ann Toth. No men were allowed. Mark Hansen didn't want men picking up or dropping off any of the Elizabeth Short. Ann Toth was kind of a special case because her boyfriend, Leo Flowers, was pals with Mark Hansen. So he was kind of the exception. But Mark Hansen had a hard and fast rule: no men. And Ann Toth said the same thing: no men in the house. And so what Elizabeth Short would do was she would have men, she would meet men a block away and then have them drop her off a block away. But almost never. There are a couple of occasions when guys showed up, but it was very, very rare. I think it was like Marvin Margolis came by, and Mark Hansen really disliked Marvin Margolis and his roommate. I think the guy's name was Robinson. Anyway, so that's like, well, that doesn't ring right either. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that just doesn't sound right. But 2 pages and George Hodel is in and out of there, and that's it. And what Mann told me in his email to me is, I don't think George Hodel did it. So that's kind of my take on it. I will have a lot more to say about William Mann's book. With like Monsters, Murders in Mid-Century Hollywood or something like that. When I'm further along in it, I've just kind of started it, but I wanted to talk about George Hodel specifically. It doesn't say a lot. It just summarizes what everybody knows already. And as I said with Eli Frankel, he doesn't talk about George Hodel at all. In the Carl Balsiger book, it's like George Hodel is just a non-entity. It doesn't exist. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about is, and I'm new to the party on this one. Spirit Box. I don't know if anybody here has heard of Spirit Box. Okay, I had never heard of Spirit Box, but there's a YouTube video by a guy named Dalen Spratt, and he did a publicity stunt. He went to Elizabeth Short's grave, and he sits down, and he has a laptop notebook, okay? And he has a Bluetooth speaker hooked to the laptop or the notebook computer, and he starts asking Elizabeth Short questions. Miss Elizabeth, are you there? And to me the sound coming out of it is just it's like, I can't make anything out of it. It just sounds like radio crosstalk. But he'll say, Miss Elizabeth, are you there? Who hurt you? Who, can you say who hurt you? And again, it'll be, oh, was that Mark? Was it George? And so, but he says, this is for entertainment purposes only. So, consider it just entertainment. But, it is, the amazing thing is this fellow, Dalen, he has thousands of subscribers. He has thousands of page views. He has 5,000 likes on his video and hundreds of comments, and so it's like, what chance does the truth have against a paranormal influencer? Yeah, you know what? There are, as I said, I'm late to the party when it comes to the Spirit Box, but there are others. There was a young lady who either she went to the Biltmore or she had created a little shrine to the Biltmore and was doing Spirit Box questions and stuff like that. So again, I'm late to the party on that stuff. But to me, going to Elizabeth Short's grave and staging this, to me, publicity stunt was really low class. I really found that incredibly distasteful. And so that's my rant on that. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier. I might have mentioned it on Instagram because I started that a little bit early. But as of today, July 15th, YouTube will no longer monetize what's called AI slop, which are videos that are totally generated with AI and the narration is totally AI. Okay. And there's a ton of those Black Dahlia videos out there that are totally AI slop. So as of today, YouTube is no longer going to monetize them. So that's sort of interesting because it's just flooded with that stuff. And yeah, anyway, okay, I have ranted enough. Let's go back and get some questions here. Let's see. I had one on Instagram. Hemicorporectomy, right, exactly. Yeah, okay. What is one of the biggest falsities from Steve Hodel and the Black Dahlia murder? Well, it's the whole thing. I mean, Steve Hodel has created this. Steve Hodel's, basically spent the last 22 years turning his father into this mass killer. And he keeps expanding. Steve Hodel keeps enlarging and expanding it. He keeps finding more evidence and he keeps changing the story, which is bizarre. I think the biggest one is where he moved Elizabeth Short's body. Elizabeth Short was found on South Norton Avenue, okay? But not in the world of Steve Hodel, because he wants to tie it to the murder of this little girl named Suzanne Degnan, who was killed a year earlier. And there's a street a couple blocks away named Degnan. And so Steve began by saying that Elizabeth Short's body was found off Degnan. Okay, no, it wasn't. You might as well say it was found off Crenshaw. It's a couple of blocks away. More recently, Steve has started saying that Elizabeth Short's body was found on Degnan and that Norton and Degnan are the same street. And, well, that would come as a big surprise to the post office and a big surprise to the people who live on Norton Avenue that is really Degnan. But Steve doesn't care about that. Steve has got this thing where the facts don't matter anymore. Elizabeth Short, to him, in the world of Steve Hodel, Elizabeth Short's body was found on Degnan, not Norton. And he will say, well, Jean French's body was found on Mountain View because that's the cemetery where Elizabeth Short was buried. No, it's Grandview. And he'll say he'll get very upset and testy about that. No, it was Grandview. The police were just mistaken about it because it's like, no, it's in the police reports. It's in the inquest. It's in all the official reports. She was found on Grandview. That doesn't matter to Steve Hodel. The facts are not an obstacle. And that's the thing. And you can go on and on. But anyway, I mean, so but the thing is, the only thing people know about George Hodel comes from Steve, all of it. And so when people repeat all the stuff about how he was a sadist and all, that's all Steve. That has, at this point, George Hodel is a fictional character that Steve Hodel has created. Okay, I've ranted long enough. Let's go over here. Let's see. Do I think the wire recordings from Hodel were destroyed? I don't know. I have no idea what would have happened to them. I do know that Mark Hansen's house was also bugged. And they didn't use wire recordings. I don't think what were described to me as great big, I don't know if you can see both, they're like, record recording discs, but they're like 3 feet wide. No joke, like 36 inches. I guess they would just turn them on and let them run, something like that. The Mark Hansen bugs, because his house was bugged also. I think the police still have those. I think those are in police evidence, or at least they were when I was talking to Brian Carr, the late Brian Carr. They had that stuff. In terms of the actual wire, it's hard to say. And at this point, the technology of playing wire recordings would be virtually impossible. If you want to know what a wire recorder looked like, it used magnetized wire instead of tape. Okay. And if you want to know what it looked like, Get the movie Two Jakes, which is the sequel to Chinatown, because they've got a wire recorder in there. But it's very buggy technology, and the actual recordings, I don't know. Okay. Let's see. Here's a question I got. Let's see here. Let's see what I have here. Oh yes, this was from an internet troll who left it on maybe YouTube. I forget. And are you saying that George Hodel wasn't rich, but he was living in that massive house? Oh, thank you for asking about the Sowden House. He was living in the Sowden House. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about that for a minute. And in the world of Steve Hodel, that's the house on Franklin where supposedly George Hodel killed Elizabeth Short and, killed her in the basement and then brought her body upstairs and cut it up in the bathtub. Okay, supposedly. Let's talk about that house for a minute in terms of what's in public records. Now, in the 1930 census, the house was owned by a guy named David Barnett, and it was worth $35,000. Okay. And I should point out, the Sowden House, what you see today, is after a $1 million plus renovation. Okay. It didn't look like that in the 1940s. It didn't look like that. That's after a $1 million plus renovation. Okay. In 1930, the house was owner occupied and it was worth $35,000. Okay. 1940, the house is no longer owner occupied. It's a rental, and it would stay a rental. Okay. 1940, the Franklin house was rented for $125 a month, and 8 people were living there. So that works out. I'll save you the trouble. It works out to like $15 and change per person. And so what we find exactly in going through public records, what we would expect to find from a rental, which is that there was a massive turnover in every 2 years. There were different people living in that house. The first time you find anybody named Hodel in there is 1946. And that is George Sr., George Hodel's dad. And regardless of what Steve says, he didn't grow up in the Sowden House. He will say, well, my dad, was head of the VD unit at the health department, and he bought a house befitting his position. None of that's true either. Okay. By 1945, George Hodel had quit the health department. He wasn't there anymore. He was in private practice. Number one. Number two, Steve's parents had divorced. Okay. George Hodel had divorced Dorothy Hodel, John Huston's first wife. So Steve was living with his mom and his brothers somewhere else. He didn't grow up at the Sowden House, regardless of, everything was going swimmingly. Dad was the king, mom was the queen, we were the 3 princes. And then one day there's a knock on the door and dad is arrested for molesting Tamar. None of that's true. Not a word of that is true. He didn't grow up there. And how do we know? Because Steve's mom kept getting arrested for child neglect. And every time she got arrested, they would post her address. So we know that he wasn't living there. So he lived in that house. Yeah. It's entirely possible that George Jr., Steve's dad, was a rich kid. His dad was an investor, a capitalist. He speculated in property. It's very likely that he owned the Sowden House and rented it out. And let me point out that when George Hodel returned from China, he didn't. If he owned the house, he couldn't move into it. He had to bounce around from hotel to hotel to hotel. He didn't have a place to live, and he couldn't move back into the Sowden House that he supposedly owned. No, he couldn't move back into that. I mean, it's just, it is this at this point. Steve has made this parallel reality. It really is. It's hard to keep on top of it. Okay, let's see. Where am I here? Exquisite Corpse. You know what? I've never even looked at Exquisite Corpse. I probably won't. I do know that there was a friend of mine named Doug Laux, who did a podcast on the Black Dahlia, and it took forever. And he interviewed, I think it was Mark Nelson, and the guy would barely talk to him. He said, that book ruined my career, or almost ruined my career, which is what a lot of people say who've gotten close to Steve Hodel, is that that about ruined my career. So I have no interest in looking at it. To me, it is just the far-fetched Steve Hodel surrealist, nonsense. Okay. Oh, you know what the spirit box is? Okay. The Voorhees question that's a Dahlia question, so I'm going to skip that. There are tens of thousands of spirit box sessions on YouTube. There probably are. Let's see. Yeah, that's what it is. It's just radio noise. Let's see. Yeah, I said Steve was still writing another book about the case. I don't know that. I mean, my take on Steve is that his case is so weak and so shaky, and he knows that. And so he keeps coming up with more evidence and more clues and more evidence and more clues. And so he will, at this point, I think on his blog, he's doing kind of a greatest hits. He's republishing stuff from a few years ago, that kind of thing. But he knows essentially that his case is weak, that it's shaky. And so he has to keep clutching at more evidence and more evidence, like, where he's got it to the point where Elizabeth Short's body was on Degnan instead of Norton. Okay. Let's see here. Do you think Steve genuinely believed what he was saying when he wrote his first book? No. I think Steve wrote the entire Black Dahlia Avenger as a scam. He knew it was a scam. That's why he wrote it in secret. He knew the photographs were not Elizabeth Short. And he talks all around that. He will say that the photographs are Elizabeth Short, but I never heard of the Black Dahlia. But I had seen this TV movie, Who is the Black Dahlia? And it's like, well, that's not Elizabeth Short. That's Lucy Arnaz that you're thinking of. But it's very clear that there are two photographs. They're different women. Neither of them are Elizabeth Short. And he'll go all the way around and he'll say, well, it doesn't matter if they're her or not. And I've heard him do this in a public presentation. It doesn't matter if they're her or not. It just served to get me in the case. And then he'll say, I think they're her. And the Short family issued a statement through me. That's not her. And the way that came about was one of Elizabeth Short's sisters went to the grocery store, saw People magazine, saw Steve Hodel's alleged photograph of Elizabeth Short, and they said, that's not her. And so they contacted me and said, and I said, will you make a statement? That's not her. And I said, yeah. So I did. And so, no, they're not her. But again, and the latest thing is Steve will say, well, German facial recognition software, he just won't let go of it. He won't let go of it. I got a question submitted, and I didn't paste it in my cheat sheet, so I'm going to have to remember it. Steve says that according to Boxy here, there are all these people who say that Elizabeth Short and George Hodel knew each other, and said that Elizabeth Short roomed in the Sowden House for a while. And it's like, I've heard Steve say a lot of things. I don't know everything that Steve says, I've never heard him say that Elizabeth Short ever lived at the Sowden House. What's in Boxy is a pretty good timeline of her movements, where she lived, especially when she got to Los Angeles. That's pretty well established where she lived, and there is absolutely nothing about her ever setting foot in the Sowden House. No. The only information in Boxy is an interview with Lillian Lunarak, and it's in Frank Jimison's. And I'm not going to, get a running start into who Frank Jimison was. Frank Jimison was an investigator for the district attorney's office. At the end of the, when they were wrapping it up, he wrote this final memo on all possible suspects. And he said, the only person who said they knew each other was Lillian Lunarak, who's an unreliable witness. And there are all these other people who say, no, he didn't, they didn't know each other. So that's, so it's all pretty conclusive. No, there really is nothing. 8 other people, but Steve plays fast and loose with what's in Boxy. A good example of that is where he has turned a very minor tangential mention of Maddie Comfort, this actress singer. He's turned that into George Hodel and Dorothy Hodel having 3-ways with Maddie Comfort. That's all made up. None of that's real. What happened was Frank Jimison, the district attorney's investigator, went out to visit Dorothy Hodel. She was living over a bait shop on Santa Monica Pier at the time. And he showed her this photograph of George Hodel and Maddie Comfort naked. And she said, that's George Hodel. And I don't know if she identified Maddie Comfort or not. But that's it. That is the entire reference. That's all there is in Boxy to Maddie Comfort. But Steve Hodel has turned this into, in the wild, crazy world of Steve Hodel, he's turned it into, they had 3-ways. No, there is absolutely nothing to indicate that all, other than Steve Hodel wanting it to be true. Let's see. Over here on Instagram, I recently visited LA and noticed the Sowden House is only a few blocks from the Florentine Gardens. Do you think George ever went there? Did he know Mark Hansen? I doubt that he knew Mark Hansen. The Florentine Gardens I forget how many shows they did a night, and it's a huge barn of a place. They could get thousands of people in there. He might have gone there. We don't know. There is no rational way to know that, maybe. But the Florentine Gardens was not, it was kind of a second-tier place compared to the Palladium or Earl Carroll's. I mean, Earl Carroll's was more of a prestige place, and the Palladium was more of a prestige place. The Florentine Gardens had entertainment that was kind of passé by the 1940s. They had Paul Whiteman, the jazz king of the 20s. They had Sophie Tucker. They had all these people that were sort of like forgotten. 20 years later, they were kind of, on their uppers. So it was that kind of entertainment. They did have dancing girl. They did have a lot of flesh. Lily St. Cyr, pardon me, was there. I did talk to Gwen Verdon. Gwen Verdon was at the Florentine Gardens. I got to interview Gwen Verdon. That was interesting. But again, the Florentine Gardens could accommodate thousands of people at a time. Maybe George Hodel wandered in there or not. We don't know. Did he know Mark Hansen? Very doubtful. There's a lot of information about Mark Hansen in Boxy. There's a lot because they investigated the heck out of him. And there is nothing to indicate that Mark Hansen knew George Hodel. Okay, let's see. So anyway, I think Steve started Black Dahlia Avenger knowing it was a scam, knowing it was BS, and then I think he has slowly talked himself into believing it. He believes it now. There's no question in my mind at all. Does Steve Hodel believe what he says? Oh yeah, absolutely, without question, he believes it's true, and he gets very indignant and very huffy if you challenge him. but that doesn't make it true. Okay, let's see. What do I think of the TV movie? Who is the Black Dahlia? That's a Dahlia question. That's not a Steve Hodel question. Sorry. Yeah, I just, yeah, I'm very happy to not do the true crime TV shows anymore. I just not interested in doing it. How much space do I want to spend on George Hodel? It's a thread through the book. I mean, it's like Severed. Severed was so influential on the Black Dahlia case that it's not. I don't just talk about Severed once and we're done. It's all the way through. What a fraud! In fact, I'm working on that now of what a fraud John Gilmore was, based on taking the frauds from the fraudulent material from Will Fowler, and then Will Fowler lying to John Gilmore. John Gilmore picked it up, and then Steve Hodel picks up a lot of things from Severed that aren't true. It's just sort of this. You can trace these threads from Will Fowler, who was the Examiner reporter who was at the crime scene. He's in the pictures. To John Gilmore and Mary Pacios, because they were collaborators for a while. To Steve Hodel, and then from Gilmore, then Steve Hodel goes just goes hard on him, like the one in This Is a Lie. Sorry, from Severed, where Elizabeth Short was forced to eat feces. That's fiction. That's made up by John Gilmore, but Steve Hodel is all over that. But it's not true. But Steve Hodel loves that story. Okay, let's see. Not saying I believe. Could Duncan have lied in his testimony to protect his father? Tamar accusing so many of rape does weaken her position, though. Yeah. I will say this about Tamar, and I get schooled all the time by, victims of sexual abuse, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, look. Before I became a journalist, I worked in the juvenile justice system for 6.5 years. And I worked in the intake area, and we dealt with lots and lots of incorrigible teenage girls. Let me tell you, runaway teenage girls by the cartload. I don't think a day went by that we didn't get a runaway teenage girl. And there definitely is a mindset with that. And I have to point out that Tamar, being a liar and manipulator, is backed up by everybody in the Hodel family. Her mother, her grandmother, her kids, everybody who dealt with Tamar said, yeah, she's a liar and manipulator, except for Steve Hodel. He says she's legit. So I believe Duncan on that one. And I think the fact that Duncan quit talking to Steve for the rest of his life is a pretty clear indication that he knew the truth. Okay. So you don't think the VJ Day footage is Elizabeth? No. Steve says it. No. Well, Steve's full of it. We know where Elizabeth Short was on each VJ Day. She was in Medford. Okay. It's just people will themselves to believe that there's this film of Elizabeth Short on Hollywood Boulevard on VJ Day. It's not true, but people want it to be true desperately. They want to have film footage of Elizabeth Short. It's not her. Sorry, she was in Medford. It's that simple. Let's see. Am I going to be doing anything special for Elizabeth Short's birthday this year? I don't know. There was a Zoom event a year ago where somebody lit candles. I think it was on her birthday, which was kind of nice. And it is coming up. Did George drive a Packard matching a description of a car leaving the scene at Norton, as Steve said? I'm not sure they knew it was a Packard. I don't know about that. I think there was a description of the kind. I think it was a description of maybe the color, something like that. But in terms of the actual make, I don't know about that. I would have to go back and look at the news accounts to see what they say. I don't recall offhand. My recollection is that there was a neighbor. There was a guy. There were a couple of people who went to that lot, and I think there was a guy a couple blocks away who went to drop rose clippings, and then he saw somebody was kind of suspicious, and then he circled the block and went back, and the car took off with a crashing of gears, and peeled out of there. I don't remember the details offhand. I would have to check my notes on that one. Let's see. Do I know if Steve had any famous cases as a detective? Yes, he had the dating game guy, Rodney Alcala. I think that was his most famous case. But beyond that, and there are people who know more about that than I do, that say, yeah, Steve played a minimal role. He did this, he did that. I can tell you that I had a conversation with, I will not say who it was, a homicide detective, who went out to interview Steve about this incident, and all Steve did was complain about why the LAPD wouldn't give him the Black Dahlia files. That's all he talked about. He was very uninterested in talking about the Rodney Alcala case. All he wanted to do was bitch about how the LAPD wouldn't let him have the Dahlia files. That was it. So he's a little obsessive in that respect. I did get one other submitted question that I would like to address, and that was about George Hodel's heart condition. Now, I don't know a lot about it. I know he had a heart condition. I know that he had a bad heart. That's why he couldn't get into the military during World War II. You would think that a doctor would be in demand. They would want a doctor in the military, in the service, but they wouldn't. The Army wouldn't take him, and the Navy wouldn't take him. He wouldn't pass the physical. And so that's one of the reasons that he went into the United Nations Relief Agency after World War II, is because the military wouldn't take him. He did have apparently some heart attacks. I'm not sure exactly of when. Somebody forwarded me some information on that. They were apparently in the 40s. But he did have a bad heart, and I forgot to pull George Hodel's death certificate. I think, I'm relying on my memory here, myocardial infarction. I think that was it, which would be a heart attack. Contrary to what Steve says, George Hodel did not commit suicide. I have his death certificate. It was not an overdose of pills, regardless of what Steve wants it to be. That's not it. Yeah. So beyond that, I don't know. I'm a little reluctant to comment on something I don't know anything about, or not much about. I haven't done my homework on that. Okay. Over here, as an English instructor, I'm fascinated by Hodel's vernacular as transcribed from his bugged house in '49. I spoke with a very old retired detective who verified that the LAPD probably recorded those. They're not tape, they're wire. And there's no telling what happened to them. It's entirely possible that they got demagnetized and reused. We don't know. Again, the technology that would be involved in playing a wire recording in 2025 would be the technological challenge would be formidable to find a wire recorder that actually works. And I assume given the world that we live in, I assume there's a collector out there somewhere who has a wire recorder who could play that. But where the actual wire is, I have no idea. Again, they might have reused it. It's entirely possible. There was no way, like if you remember on audio cassettes, you could pop out the tab so you couldn't record over it. There was no way to do that with wire. It's entirely possible that it got, that the wire got erased and reused. We don't know. Mark Hansen, when they bugged his house, those were on discs for some reason. And so those got saved. My understanding is that those were in LAPD evidence, and they were huge discs. So that's all I know about that. Yeah, okay. See, I knew somebody would have a wire recorder. I knew that. I knew somebody would. I have only seen a wire recorder once in my life. I don't think there was any wire with it. I think it was just the recorder. But again, it's very primitive technology. The sound quality is going to be iffy. If there's nothing in the LAPD files, then why can't we see them? That's the LAPD culture. You have to understand the LAPD culture. And I will tell you right now that one of the reasons the LAPD won't release the Dahlia files is because of Steve Hodel. He has antagonized robbery homicide to such a degree, claiming that the department was corrupt and covered up the murder and all that stuff, that he has screwed it for everybody. Nobody's going to get it. No, it well may be, given LAPD culture, that no one will ever get into those files. But I guarantee you, no one is going to get into those files as long as Steve Hodel is living and breathing. It ain't going to happen. He has screwed it for everybody, because if they give it to somebody else, they're going to have to give it to Steve, and they won't. And I will say again, as I said before, when one of the things Brian Carr, when I interviewed Brian when he was custodian of the Black Dahlia case, and he said, if Hodel had come to me before he wrote his book and asked to see his dad's file, I would have showed it to him out of professional courtesy. He never asked to see it. And so that was the last time I saw Brian. I had lunch with him, and that was one of the things he said was, he had told me that before. If Hodel had asked to see the file on his dad, I would have showed it to him. He never asked to see it. So but you have to understand the LAPD culture, the culture of the Los Angeles Police Department. It is very siloed, or whatever you want to call it. It's very insular. It's not like there's a lot of discussions between departments. Robbery homicide is its own its own organization, and in my opinion, based on lots and lots of research, the homicide detectives, the guys working RHD downtown, are the cream of the crop, and that's generally how it is in law enforcement. The guys working homicide are really, you have to be really good, but you also have to really be able to tolerate a lot of tragedy in terms of blood and shooting and stuff like that. And Harry Hansen said that in an interview. He said there's some guys who are great detectives, but they wash out of homicide because you're going to one killing after another, and these guys, it's a lot to take, and I understand that. My friend Miles Corwin, he did a couple of he did the Killing Fields, and boy, I'm drawing a blank on the other book, but he did two books where he rode around with the LAPD homicide cops, and it was all gang shootings. The majority, well, except for the Robert Blake Killing Fields, and I forget the name of the other. Anyway, they're great books. I would strongly recommend that you get them, read them. But again, he said, 90, the majority of the homicide cases that they got called on were somebody walked up on a street corner, little monsters shot Snoopy, and nobody saw anything. And he said that was typical. They ran into that all the time. I wish I could. I'll put it in the comments what Miles's two books are, Miles Corwin, because they're definitely worth a read. Okay. Was there ever a moment when you sort of believed Hodel might be onto? No, never. The way I actually have, no, I don't have the original. I have the paperback. I'm using this one because it's indexed. Okay, there's an index in the back of it. The OG version of Black Dahlia Avenger doesn't have an index, so I'm using that one because it's got an index to it. What happened was, and this is kind of a long story. Steve Lopez is a columnist at the Los Angeles Times. And Steve Hodel went to one of Steve Lopez's book appearances, that, I'm going to have a book coming out. Would you be interested in looking at it? And Steve Lopez said, okay. So Black Dahlia Avenger comes out, and Steve gets it to Steve Lopez. And the first thing Steve Lopez says is, well, I'm going to have our Black Dahlia guy check it out. And the publicist, Kim of LA, said, the one person in the world we don't want to see this book is Larry Harnish. That's a direct quote, which ought to tell you immediately it's a scam. Anyway, Steve Lopez came over and showed me the book, and I started reading it, and it's like, okay. And then once I got to the pictures, it's like, oh, this is all bullshit. No, that's not her. It's totally made up. And that was it. Once I got to the pictures, it's like, no, this is fake. This is all crap. And that was it. So no, I knew it was. Once I saw the pictures, I knew it was all fake. Let's see. Besides, is there anyone passionate about debunking Steve Hodel's claims? There are. I should mention a couple of friends of mine. They were friends of Fauna Hodel, Fauna number one. They got to know Fauna Hodel independently. Fauna Hodel was George Hodel's granddaughter. She was Tamar Hodel's oldest daughter. Tamar Hodel handed Fauna off to a washroom attendant in Nevada. And Fauna grew up thinking that she was part black, which of course she wasn't. Anyway, these two individuals became friends with Fauna. And at one point, Fauna asked these two people, would you check out Steve Hodel's claims? Independently of me. I mean, I had heard from them a little bit, but they did a lot of pick and shovel work. They did a lot of research, and I have to hand it to them. They really did a lot of really, really good research on stuff that I would have never looked at. One of them went through all of the Man Ray stuff, all the Man Ray notebooks, everything else. And they did a lot of really good pick and shovel work. And they came back and told Fauna, no, this is all crap. This is all bullshit. It's not true. Which didn't stop Fauna from incorporating all of Steve's claims into her life story, which she did. If you read the early version of, like the script of the movie that they were making about her life, Pretty Hattie's Baby, something like that, there's nothing about George Hodel in there. It's only later on, once Black Dahlia Avenger came out, certain members of the Hodel family jumped on the Black Dahlia Avenger gravy train. They did. And Fauna was one of them, regardless of asking these friends to check it out. And these people also talked to Tamar. I didn't. The only contact I ever had with Tamar was somebody claiming to be Tamar contacted me. And if that was not a discussion I wanted to pursue, because on the internet, you don't know if it's really Tamar or not. But I did hear from someone claiming to be Tamar. I didn't pursue it. I've heard from other people claiming to be Hodel's. And with the exception of the people I contacted who were the Philippine branch of the family. I was in contact with the Philippine branch of the family, and they hate Steve. They frickin' hate Steve Hodel. Boy, do they hate Steve. I was in contact with them. But other than these two people that I mentioned who were friends with Fauna, that's about it. Everybody is really willing, especially now, to just take what Steve says. They just kind of regurgitate it. It's a lot of investigating, fact-checking Steve Hodel is a lot of work. It is really, really a lot of work. And most people don't want to do it. They want a Wikipedia article. They want to something easy, a TikTok video on George Hodel, and they're happy. Or, the spirit box, Miss Elizabeth, did George hurt you? That's what people want. Anyway, let's see. What did my previous question about George Hodel as a suspect? Let's see. Conversations on tape. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is a good one. And this is kind of a good way to wrap up. Was George Hodel ever a prime suspect in the Black Dahlia case? No, that's an invention of Steve Hodel. Steve Hodel's done a lot of inventing. The lone woman murders, okay, everybody know that's an invention of Steve Hodel. They were never called that. George Hodel was never, ever the prime suspect in the Black Dahlia case. He was under surveillance for 5.5 weeks, and they were done with him. The only prime suspects would have been Red Manley, okay? Joseph Dumais, this soldier back at Fort Dix who said, "Oh yeah, I killed Elizabeth Short," and then it turns out he'd never left the base. And then Leslie Dillon. Those three people would have been prime suspects. Anybody else? No. George Hodel was a footnote. If there was a just world, George Hodel would be a footnote in the Black Dahlia case. But Steve Hodel has been exploiting his LAPD career for the last 22 years to establish this fictional creation with the same name as his father as this super genius serial killer who traveled the world committing famous unsolved murders. And Instagram, I have got to say goodbye to you, or Instagram will eat my video. And again, this could be the last Instagram video because I don't have 1,000 subscribers and I never will. Okay. Yes, that's right. Okay. Bye-bye. Oh, let's see. And somebody on Instagram said, yes, Mountain View doesn't give out the location of Elizabeth Short's grave. Unfortunately, given the internet nature of everything, it's on every true crime website where it is. So I can be an internet influencer and go with my spirit box and sit at Elizabeth Short's grave. The only thing paranormal about the guy going to Elizabeth Short's grave and doing the spirit box and what's that, Miss Elizabeth, is while he's doing that, and look it up, it's kind of funny. He's got, he said, "I'm getting ants in my pants." And so he has to stand up because he's been sitting on an ant's nest. And so the bugs are getting in his pants. So he brushes himself and sits down again, and the bugs are after him again. And honestly, if there is anything paranormal about that whole video, it's the ants attacking the guy. That would be Elizabeth Short's mojo telling the guy to knock it off. But none of this spirit box stuff is like, nah, I don't think so. Okay. Instagram is off. YouTube, I am going to say goodbye in a moment. It's been fun. Thanks for coming by. The Ask Me Anything on the Black Dahlia will be August 5th. I will be talking about William Mann's forthcoming book on the Black Dahlia. I will read it by then and have a better handle on what it says, other than just a couple pages on George Hodel, and I'll leave it at that. So, okay, August 5th, we'll talk about William Mann's book, and I will see you then. Thanks for coming. August is coming up. Can you believe it? It doesn't seem possible. And if anybody knows anything going on for Elizabeth Short's birthday, let me know. I usually do something. I'm not sure what exactly. But yeah, it is coming up. Okay. See you later. Have a great week.